So what's the ideal barn setup for a homesteader? I get that question often, and so today we're going to talk about some barn principles to help you figure out what's ideal for you. So more and more, I'm hearing from people trying to figure out what's the best barn setup for their homestead situation, and that's a very relevant question. Barns are big structures, they're expensive, and you're trying to accomplish a lot of things, so you really want to do your best to get it right or to use whatever you have in the best way possible. I don't think there is an ideal for everybody. What your barn needs to be has to do a lot with your climate to a certain degree and what it is you're doing, what animals you have. So it's going to look a little bit different for everybody, but there are definitely some principles that we found over the years, from living on different properties to building out this barn that we've been working on for 6 years to, just a lot of different experience. So I definitely think there are some key principles that you can plug and play depending on your needs that will help you set up a barn that works for you in your homestead. The first thing we want to talk about is kind of barn size and space, right? There's some commonalities to most barns that you see for good reason. Most barns have got a breezeway like we've got right here, an aisle down the center that's workable, accessible, and allows you to move around, allows you to bring vehicles in and out, just all kinds of things. So it's kind of a traffic throughway. And that's really, really essential to have. We'll talk about size in just a moment. Next, you generally have animal stalls, right? Those are going to go usually to both sides of the breezeway. However, if you're building from scratch and you need to start on a budget, you might start with the breezeway and stalls on one side. But that's usually a core part of a barn and a barn layout. Often, you're then going to have a place outside the barn structure for animals. It could just be a barnyard, divided up for the different animals that you have. But a lot of barns then have a space with a roof over it on the outside. So the animals have some indoor space and they have a little bit of outdoor space at a minimum that's still under roof that gives them a little bit of shelter. And that's pretty common to most barns, and that works very, very well. So we're going to stick with that. I say that's a great layout to go with. Now let's talk about sizing. Getting the sizing on your breezeway is really, really important. I've seen breezeways everywhere from 12 foot at the narrowest to over 16 feet. And 12 feet is not very doable. That is just not very workable. You bring a vehicle in it to bring hay in, to bring feed in, to pick up an animal. You can't hardly move around that. Even if you've got a tractor or any kind of stuff coming and going, which you're generally going to want in a barn, 12 foot for a breezeway is really, really narrow. You can get by with 14 feet, but it's still very narrow. And you've got to think past just what you can see right now, because you will want vehicles in it. You will want equipment in it. You may need to store hay in it. You want this breezeway to be the right size. And we stored our hay because the only place we had, once we started putting these stalls in, we stored our hay down the middle. This breezeway is 16 feet. If it had been 12 or 14, it would have been very hard to get even enough hay in here width-wise to store it, feed the animals, and move around. 16 feet is the ideal width without overbuilding. So 16 feet allows you to get a vehicle in here, tractors in here. It allows you to maneuver a little bit. It allows you to store things in here if this needs to be your hay storage for the winter, which is what we did for the first several years. You've still got room to move down the aisles. You can get animals in and out of stalls if you need to with that feed storage. I can't tell you how much I would never build a barn less than 16 feet. If you can afford to go a little wider, great, go for it, but you start to getting into substantial cost when you get bigger than 16 foot. So I would say that's an ideal. That's an essential for every barn, no matter where you're at. So let's talk about animal stalls. Typically, you've got stalls on each side. If you were starting from scratch and you're building a barn, you got a budget, I would still build the breezeway. I would make sure that gets put into the structure. I could maybe do animal stalls on one side, to get me going, and then with the idea if I can build them later. And we'll give you a little bit of drawing here to just show you how you could plug and play eventually. Animal stall sizes, 12 by 12 is the standard. It's what you're gonna see in a lot of kits. It's what works for animals of all sizes, from horses usually being the largest, a horse or a cow that you're gonna have in the barn, down to goats and sheep, pigs, and even if you need to turn one of them into a functional room or a chicken coop, 12 by 12 works great, and it's the ideal size. There's really no need to ever go bigger. While you could do a little smaller, you wouldn't want to go smaller than 10 by 10. It just doesn't give you enough space, for the animals to have a feed trough in there, to have water in there, to have bedding, and for them to move around. And of course you need them to have access. And for a lot of animals, that's not enough space. I'm not saying that's enough space at 12 by 12 for any animal, period, for winter housing. It's actually not for your larger animals. But for an indoor space inside the barn, 12 by 12 is the sweet spot. And so you want to try to lay out a barn with the idea of a 16-foot breezeway and 12-foot by 12-foot stalls on one and probably both sides. Okay, so we've got our ideal breezeway at 16-foot wide. Our stalls are going to be then 12-foot wide on each side, and we're going to build them 12-foot this way, which is going to create some modularity as we go, and we'll talk about how you can have a starting point and build onto this. But I do want to talk about outside of that. It's essential to have space for these animals to get to outside the barn. Any time of the year that you're in there, even in winter, they really need to get outside and have a little bit of movement. Now, it's nice to have a little bit of covered space outside. And so we have lean-tos on this barn, and you'll see a lot of barns like this that have another 12 by 12 space outside under roof. It's more open, there's no walls out there, but it does give them some room when this, especially in winter climate here, the snow gets really deep, and they've got a yard beyond the barn structure, but they're often not going out into it, so they've got some space to get outside. That's good for their health, it's good for their movement, and most animals that you're gonna have in the barn, especially cows and horses, particularly anything of that size, a 12 by 12 is not enough for them all winter. They need some minimum space to get out and move around in a little bit. That lean-to is a good idea as well, but you don't have to start there. If you're building from scratch, you can get your structure down and then add these pieces as you move along. That's actually what we've done with this barn over the last 6 years. Lastly, let's talk about height a little bit. All of this matters when you're building a barn, especially if you're designing one and you're building it, because of course you got to pay for all the materials. And so you want to make the best use of your space, but you don't want to have to buy more materials than you need. What's the ideal height for the breezeway and the stalls? Well, the stalls, 10 feet is probably fine. We've got a sloped roof. 8 feet on the outside would be the minimum, probably 10 foot. But in the breezeway, you need more height. And this barn is 14 feet to the trusses here, the bottom of these rafters. It's 14 feet. It's pretty adequate. 16 feet would be ideal. We're already 16 feet wide. 16 feet high would be ideal. I can get all my trailers in here. I can get a lot of things in. There could be some trailers I couldn't get in. We might be processing animals. 14 feet, if you're trying to butcher, say, a steer or a really big elk or something like that, it's a little light for hanging and a few other things I've ran into over the years. 16 feet would be ideal. 14 feet works pretty good. We just run into a few snags here and there. You could get by with 12 if you're trying to save dollars, but it is gonna kind of cramp your style a little bit, and you might find that you've got a hard time getting in and out with some things that you might want to get in and out of there. So shoot for 16 if you can. Here's the really neat thing about these dimensions. These are all standard lumber dimensions. So whether you're building this yourself, whether you're having somebody else build it, 16-foot and 12-foot dimensions are very standard lumber dimensions, and they're a reasonable cost. So it makes this very modular and easy to plug and play, easy to build it over time if you want, and not be buying expensive materials. Once you get past 16 feet, your material in general goes up in cost per board foot. So it is, again, the sweet spot with space and with material usage. You don't have a lot of waste either. You can add to it over time, which is what we've done here. You can start with what you can afford. So if you're starting from scratch and you're trying to design a barn and you get this layout, but you know, you either don't have the animals, you don't need a big barn yet, but you know, you're going to in the future, or your budget doesn't allow, you can build out your breezeway at 16 feet, your 12-foot stalls, and then you can build it by whatever amount of stalls you want, but you can stop. So you might have this layout sideways and go, well, I can only afford for 2 stalls on each side, so it's going to be 24 foot deep. That's great, no problem. You might know, hey, in a few years, we're going to add some animals to the program, or our budget will allow. You can then easily add on 12-foot increments to the barn as far as you want. Ours goes down, we're about, I think, 6 stalls deep here. You know, and you can come at it a couple different ways. You could build your outside shell, only do stalls on one side, only do it so long. So it gives you a lot of flexibility in this kind of modular plug and play design to build to fit your situation now, but leave yourself room. Just make sure you leave the land out there, however you position the barn on the land, to then add on to it as you grow. So let's talk about some components of the stall. There's a lot of different ways to do this. And I mean, one of the main goals is keep the animals in, right? Whatever animals you're housing. In the homestead situation, you're often housing many different size animals, and you're sometimes having to move things around. You've got one setup in the winter, but then you get some sheep lambing, or the goats kidding, or you got to get pigs together to breed. And so sometimes you're having to move things around in a homestead situation with multiple different types of animals. So I want some flexibility in the system. And so right off the bat on the outside, there's a few things you'll notice, like this gate. This gate can keep everything but chickens in all the way up to horses if we need to, because of the wire mesh. So I really prefer that over a barred gate or anything else. This allows me to use this stall for any animal except for the birds anytime. And so we have gates like this everywhere. We also have the same setup on the wood. You can do rails in many different ways. You'll see barns that have solid, built solid wood all the way up. You can do a whole lot of different things. There's a couple key features in here. We wanted every stall to keep everything in, from pigs, goats, sheep, and cows. We also wanted to be able to build up deep bedding. We're doing deep bedding in our barn, so we do need a little bit of solidness right here. So you can see we've built this up solid so that as the bedding builds in the barn, it stays inside. It doesn't just fall out, but yet it has some openness to it. Airflow is really, really important in a barn, and I'll talk about that in a second with how they get to the outside. But we wanted a little bit of airflow here. I have some feeders in here. This was an experiment. We built some feeders on the outside. They work okay. There's lots of different things you can do. You can also do hanging feeders like we have with the goats. You can do it a myriad of things. I do like this. It's nice that we can just walk up, drop the hay in it, though it does impede on our breezeway a little bit, and it has caused us some challenges. Let's talk about the outside. Generally with a barn, you're trying to create an environment with some enclosure, right? Some protection from the elements, mostly moisture coming down and wind blowing. And so we've got walls on part of the barn to give our animals. And again, we've built it, and as a homesteader, we're approaching this from a homesteading perspective, multiple species animals, we're kind of trying to cover everybody. So we want some sort of solid walls. Those can be a lot of things. In this case, the structure was here, it's metal, it works great. We do need to have access to the outside. What we have in is just 4-foot doors, and that's the same with these spaces here. This is plenty of room to move cows through, any animal, never too tight. So I wouldn't go less than a 4-foot opening right here. Same going outside. You don't want to close your barn down in the wintertime. You need airflow. It is unhealthy to close in a barn. You're gonna get very, very high humidity, and you're going to be likely to cause some health problems with your animals from that lack of fresh air, high humidity, and then if you get behind on managing the manure, your deep bedding, then that can add to the problem. So you'll see every one of our stalls has a 4-foot opening for animals to go in and out, but also to allow for good airflow. That is very, very important in a barn design. Let's talk about dividing the barn stalls. Most barns you see have solid dividers. They're built in the place, they're not movable. And when we set out to design this barn, I wanted to do something very different. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that I found that sometimes I want a bigger stall. I want 24 foot long because we've got more sheep or more goats. And we're doing a deep bed method. So this barn is designed to, instead of mucking the stalls every day and all of that work and removing the manure, we're adding carbon every day and basically building a compost pile on the floor, which, by the way, generates some heat and does provide a little bit for the animals to moderate the winter climate. But we're putting a lot of material in here to manage the manure and turn that waste product into something valuable, like I've talked about in other videos. So that means we need a good way to access it and clean it out. So instead of fixed walls, we've put in gates. These gates are both movable, meaning we can swing them, and they're removable. And at the end of the barn, we have doors that open up so we can get in here with people in wheelbarrows or a tractor and come in and clean the stalls out, open a gate, clean the next stall out, and move on down when it's time to do that. And so that gives us a lot of flexibility in management. It allows us to manage this deep bedding, and it allows us, you know, to change the stall sizes depending on, like, what if we decided, hey, we don't want to do pigs and goats anymore, but we want to do a whole lot of sheep, and now we got, you know, 25 sheep that we're wintering over. Well, you know, we'd want multiple of these 12-foot bays. Piece of cake, easy to do. I don't have to remodel. I just pull out a couple gates, takes 5 minutes each. So I have found that to be very, very valuable besides the manure management. Let's just talk about ground surface for a moment. There's a lot of different options, but for a barn, good old ground works pretty good. You really don't have to do more than that. You know, would concrete in here be ideal? Yeah, it'd be nice to be able to sweep it off, really clean it out, make things tidy. Yeah, it could be nice, but that's a huge expense, and you're already investing a lot into this space. So you do not need concrete in here. You could bring in some road base type gravel. You know, if you had very soft earth, you know, that maybe got mucked up or got really dusty and didn't compact very well. So depending on your soil type, I could see some reasons to lay down some gravel to just give you a little more solid base within your breezeway. Now, I wouldn't do that in the animal stalls, but within the breezeway if you need to. But you got a roof over it. It's generally going to stay dry. It's not going to get muddy. So the biggest issue is just stirring up a lot of dust, really, and you know, creating yourself a little more solid surface. So you can do that if you want, but most of the time, there's no need to you know, invest in anything. This is a clean space. You can see there's some wood chips and shavings because of how we do the cows on the end. I don't want a solid surface that any of the urine or manure is just sitting on, even though I'm adding carbon into it. That just, you know, there's no absorption there. And the same with the gravel. I don't want gravel mixed in when I'm cleaning it out. That's actually a pain. I've seen that a lot, and it is a pain to clean out your bedding or your manure or however you're managing it in gravel. So you just want earth in there and give a good base of carbon, wood chips, shavings, whatever you have access to, and manage it that way. So no need for really any hardscape in the flooring. Sometimes you need some other space besides animal housing, right? You might need a place to milk your cows. You might need a milking room. You might need a tack shed of sorts. That's just fine. These 12 by 12 modular rooms are great. If you needed a big one, you could do 12 by 24. So they fit right into the plan. Matter of fact, we've got a chicken coop on one end that fits right into that plan, and we do have a milking stanchion and a place where we're storing our feed that eventually we're going to turn into a room, and concrete floor and some better storage, a little easier to clean the stanchion, all of that. Right now we're just utilizing the space. So that's, again, the neat thing about this is you may need some of those spaces, and you can build them, you can build the outside structure, and in time, when you can afford it, you can then enclose it and enclose a room, and that 12 by 12 just works great. You don't really have to go then and try to build something different or off to the side. So really nice functionality there. We do have a part of our barn here that you can see that kind of turns this whole concept on its head. And the reason is because we have more cows. And having more cows inside this area here wouldn't work real well. It's fine for a couple dairy cows or a beef cow if you're getting a feeder through the winter or whatever. This modular 12-foot stalls works fine. You can make them a little bit bigger. But when you start to get a handful of beef cows or more, there becomes a little bit more challenge, especially with the manure management, because it's going to build up a lot and you're having to feed a lot more hay. We've actually kind of turned everything on its head here and built this space out here for the beef cows where the hay is actually, you know, kind of in line with all these stalls on the outside, and we've got feeding gates, and then the animals are right here, what looks like it's in the breezeway, though it's more open when you go around the corner over here, so they've got good space to move around in for the winter. But the key function of this is two things doing it this way. One, it's very easy to feed. We got a lot of animals to feed, so we don't want to be walking back and forth across the barn a long ways. We want to be able to get the feed right close to them, feed them real easily. But two, we've got to bring in a lot more carbon for this amount of animals. It's very hard to get that amount of carbon into these stalls, let alone out, and it gets a lot deeper. So this allows us tractor access to get our wood shavings that we've got to add a couple times a week in here for about 10 cows. Electricity is not essential unless you're in a northern climate. Water is. And so at a bare minimum, you want to get water to your barn. You want to get frost-free riser in your barn if you're in a cold climate that you freeze. Basically what that is, if you don't know, is that it goes down several feet into the ground below the frost line. And so when you turn it off, it actually turns it off down underground and it drains the water into a gravel bed so your water doesn't freeze. There's a lot of ways to go about water. We've always had hoses and hook the hoses up, water everything, and then you got to go through the time to drain the hoses and hang them right. It's a lot of fussing around. The other way to go, but which is really expensive, is the frost-free risers in all your water stalls. And there definitely are some great options out there. The problem is they're expensive, especially for the average homesteader. So we came up with a system of hard pipe overhead that drops down with some hoses, and that way, instead of messing with the hoses and draining them in this cold climate, we can just turn the water on, fill everything up, turn the water off, and open the valves, and this just gravity drains out. Really, really easy, not very expensive. It was a few $100s for the pipe and valves. We just hook it up with a hose to our riser. That's a nice system. So that's what we've come up with. There's a lot of ways to do it, and of course, if you're not freezing, you're not so worried about it. If you're in a cold climate like ours, you've got to deal with frozen water, and that means you need a way to thaw it, or break it up. But if you're really cold, and we get cold enough where part of the season we can just break it up, not a big deal. But if you get cold enough where you're going to start getting inches of ice, that can get really, really hard to deal with over weeks of cold. You need some sort of defroster, which then means you need electricity. And of course, lights are nice. We've got lights in here. This barn had electricity when we got here. But we ran power cords and we did a lot of stuff that's not recommended. You got to be careful with electricity in the barn because you get a lot of dust and you're going to have some fire hazards. So when we went to finally put permanent electricity in here so we could get a few plugs and we could get some water heaters to our troughs, we went with all hard-lined pipe and hard sealed boxes so that one, you don't get rats or mice chewing on them, and two, where all your junctions are, it's in a nice sealed box where it's very, very hard for dust to get in. I imagine every few years I'll take a peek in there, but that dust building up where there's electrical junctions is a fire hazard. So whatever you do, just be careful how you handle electricity in barns, because that is probably your largest liability in a barn, is the potential for electrical fire. So think it through, be smart about it. Ideal barn? I don't know if there is one, right? We've got pretty close to the ideal situation for here, and I think all the components and everything that I've given to you today can help you come up with and at least think through what would be the ideal situation for you. These are proven sizes, spaces that will work really well. You've got a modular system you can plug and play, build over time. So I hope this has been helpful to you. If you're interested in more about our barn or just how we manage the animals all year long, you can check out this video right here.